Thank you all for being here. I'm going to briefly present the report's key findings and recommendations. But to begin, a word about why PEN took on this project. As a free expression organization, an important part of our work includes defending the public's right to know. This is also referred to as freedom of information. This is the hallmark and the cornerstone of any open democratic society. An informed public is essential to ensuring government accountability and transparency, and to fostering the sometimes contentious debates a democracy must have about the limits of government power and what is required to ensure national security. We took on the issue of whistleblowers because government workers are our first responders when it comes to detecting government misconduct. They are in the best position to raise an alarm and set in motion the steps necessary to address the problem. We know that broadly, the American public supports whistleblowers and wants to make sure they're protected. In many areas they are, but in others, like the vital US national security sector, we're falling short. PEN has observed a troubling disconnect between what the public believes is true in terms of protections available to whistleblowers and what protections actually exist for workers in the national security area. Many government officials on both sides of the aisle have made remarks about the protections Edward Snowden would have enjoyed if he had pursued more internal channels to raise his concerns. But what they've said doesn't match up to the reality of the laws in place, which leave large gaps in protection for intelligence community workers, particularly for contractors like Snowden. And officials' calls that Snowden should come home to make his case in court are hard to square with the reality of what Snowden would actually be able to say in a courtroom to defend himself from the Espionage Act charges he faces. The report begins by looking at the protections available to intelligence community workers who try to raise concerns internally. There aren't many. If they are retaliated against, they can lodge a complaint with their agency's inspector general, but these offices often lack independence, and they certainly lack power. They can make a recommendation that action be taken to address the retaliation, but they have no enforcement power, so their recommendations may be ignored. In some cases, the inspector general offices have themselves been accused of retaliating against a whistleblower. And under the current framework, whistleblowers can't go to court to challenge retaliatory actions or to appeal the inspector general's determination of their complaint. As a result, there is little deterrence against retaliation. Whistleblowers also aren't protected from retaliatory criminal investigations or prosecution, leaving them most vulnerable to the most serious forms of retaliation. As one of the people interviewed for this report noted, if it's not lawful to fire someone for blowing the whistle, it shouldn't be lawful to put them in jail. Finally, the scant protections that do exist for intelligence community whistleblowers would not help them if the concerns they want to raise have to do with programs that are nominally authorized by law or sanctioned by their agency, as the NSA's mass surveillance programs and the CIA's torture program were. In cases of systemic misconduct, the internal channels provide no protection against retaliation. Some national security workers still feel driven by the demands of their conscience to bring systemic misconduct to light because they believe it is in the public's interest to know about it. They often do this by approaching a journalist and leaking the information. Government leaks to the press happen every day. They are an accepted part of Washington policymaking. But leaks that have been made with the intention of serving the public interest, particularly under President Obama's administration, have been aggressively prosecuted. This administration has charged at least 9 leakers under the Espionage Act, a law intended to target foreign spies that was passed in 1917 at the height of the Red Scare as the United States entered World War I. And this is another major disconnect between what the public understands about these cases and the reality. We hear government officials call for them to make their case in court. In fact, courts have ruled that a defendant's intent in leaking information is irrelevant under the Espionage Act, so defendants can't even attempt to make their case that they disclosed information because they believed the public had a vital need to know about it. PEN's report highlights these disconnects between public perception and reality to show that the gaps in existing protections for intelligence community whistleblowers, coupled with the government's failure to adequately address retaliation against them, and the Obama administration's aggressive prosecution of leakers under the Espionage Act, are damaging to freedom of expression, press freedom, and access to information in the United States. The combined impact of these elements has created a chilling effect on free expression and affects both the willingness of government workers to expose wrongdoing and the ability of journalists to cover their revelations. This poses serious risks for the free flow of information and the informed public debate that is necessary for a healthy democratic society. We close the report with a set of recommendations for the executive and legislative branches. I will highlight 3 of these. First, the government should establish strong, clear protections for all intelligence community workers that apply across agencies and to all categories of workers, including contractors. Second, Congress should reform the Espionage Act to allow defendants to raise a public interest defense in cases of disclosure to the public, and the Justice Department should limit prosecutions under the Act to offenders intending to harm U.S. national defense. Third, the government should implement protections against employment retaliation and criminal prosecution of whistleblowers, including access to courts to challenge retaliation and holding retaliators accountable. And with that, I'll turn to Susan Glasser, Editor-in-Chief of Politico, to introduce our panelists. Thank you very much.
Why, thank you, Katie, so much. I have to say, it is a particular delight both to be here with Katie and Suzanne and Penn itself here at the museum. What a terrific and important conversation today, and it is a delight to be a part of it. I'm going to invite our panelists to come on up and take their seats while I introduce them. You already have information about them as well, but we're joined today by Jim Risen from the New York Times, who has quite a story to tell. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but let's just say it's directly relevant to the question of the Obama administration and its handling of whistleblowers. We are also joined today by Jesselyn, who is a whistleblower herself, as well as currently the head of the Source Protection Program at ExposeFacts. Thank you so much, Jesselyn, for joining us. And our final panelist today is Thomas Drake, who also identifies as a whistleblower. He is a former senior executive in the government at the NSA and other parts of the government. And I think this is a pretty extraordinary collection of people who have firsthand experiences with some of the substance that's contained in this report, although I would direct all of you to spend a little time delving deeper into it. Whether you're a journalist, a concerned citizen, or just someone who understands and is concerned about the boundaries between privacy and the government, this is an important report, and I haven't seen anything like it. So, there's a lot of material to chew over. Thank you. Go ahead and jump right in to our conversation because there is so much firsthand experience really on this panel and in this conversation today. Jim, my guess is that many people here are familiar with the broad contours of your recent experience, but one of the striking takeaways, I think, for me in this report and for many people, right, is that although we are now deep into the second term of President Barack Obama, constitutional law professor turned politician, there hasn't necessarily been the sort of sharp shift away from the Bush administration you might have expected. And I think your case is evidence of that. Now, you recently have been, in effect, told by Attorney General Eric Holder and confirmed by new Attorney General Loretta Lynch that in your case you won't be compelled or sent to jail for not testifying. But what has been your personal experience in terms of the question of how, as a journalist, you interact with whistleblowers? What were they trying to do to you? How close do you feel you came to actually ending up in jail?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Penn is a great organization. I think my case has a lot of twists and turns and goes back over a long period of time. I was subpoenaed first to testify in a grand jury involving a book I wrote in 2006. I was subpoenaed in 2008 and for a grand jury, and then I fought that, and then I was successful at the grand jury level, and the judge eventually. Well, it's several steps. One, the first grand jury expired because the judge kind of delayed things during the 2008 election, I think, although she never quite said it that way. And so the great surprise in my case was the subpoena was first issued by the Bush administration in January 2008, and I thought that when Obama got elected that the case would disappear. And I think the judge did too, because in July of 2009, the judge issued a very brief order saying, I see that the grand jury in this case has expired, and I give the government 10 days to decide whether or not to pursue this further. And in that order, she said that because the grand jury's expired, the subpoena of Risen is now moot. And so basically it was an invitation to the Obama administration to let this drop. All they had to do was not do anything for 10 days in July 2009. And instead they immediately told the judge, no, we want to keep pursuing this case. We want to continue the subpoena. And the judge said, no, you can't continue the subpoena because that was issued by Attorney General Mukasey of the Bush administration. You have to get a new subpoena. And so Eric Holder they issued a new subpoena. And then the case continued throughout the rest of the Obama administration. I kept getting subpoenaed, and the judge kept siding with me over several subpoenas. And then finally, the Obama administration took it to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. The district court was in Virginia. And they argued before the appeals court that there's no such thing as a reporter's privilege. Reporters have no right to not testify and not reveal confidential sources. And that was the official position of the Obama administration, that there is no such thing as a reporter's privilege or a shield law or any kind of protections for confidential sources. And they won at the appeals court, and I took it to the Supreme Court and lost. And basically, at that point, the only thing I was able to do was just refuse to cooperate. So I had no legal recourse. And finally, the Obama administration relented only because they were getting a lot of bad publicity. They had won legally, and Holder and I think the White House was tired of the bad publicity, and so they finally decided not to force me to go to jail after I refused to testify. So that happened earlier this year.
You've obviously had a lot of occasion to reflect upon the question of why the Obama administration has taken this position. I'm sure you've also talked with a lot of people here in Washington around that. It does seem surprising and also at odds with some of the rhetoric that senior officials in the Justice Department have had about freedom of speech. What is your conclusion around why they pursued this case and others with such zeal? I think many people are surprised to find out actually that more journalists have been prosecuted or more people have been prosecuted in the connection with leaks under this administration, I believe, than ever before.
I think it's part of their larger national security policies. I think they've basically extended and continued most of the Bush administration's national security policies. And if you are going to continue waging the global war on terror in the same way that George Bush did, you have to kind of suppress dissent, and you want to keep operations secret. They want to not let the public know about things like bulk data collection of all the phone calls in the United States. And so, I think the crackdown on whistleblowers and on reporters is part of a larger national security policy. Mm-hmm. So,
Jesselyn, you also have had some personal experience both in the Bush administration and on the other side of the line as an attorney in the Obama administration. Do you agree that there has not been very much, if any, shift, or if anything, the Obama administration is actually tougher on whistleblowers?
I think the Obama administration, which I campaigned for, contributed to, and voted for, has been far worse than Bush. As an attorney at the Justice Department who blew the whistle on ethical misconduct in the case of a terrorist suspect, I was put under a federal criminal leak investigation, referred to the state bars in which I'm licensed as an attorney, and put on the no-fly list, but I was never indicted. That didn't happen until Obama. And as you mentioned, it has happened. 9 different people have been indicted under the Espionage Act for non-spy activity. And 7 of those people are clearly classic whistleblowers. So I think it's worse.
What is your analysis of why on earth is that happening? Is there an architect of this policy? I've always wanted to ask people who've studied this more than I have. Is it just a bureaucratic default?
You know, during the Ashcroft tenure at the Justice Department, he had an anti-leak task force, and clearly no president likes leaking. But I think, I know there had been a discussion about the administration having a crackdown on leaks and going after one person from each intelligence agency. So I think it was strategized. Why it happened under Obama, I think, despite his rhetoric that whistleblowers are, quote, courageous and patriotic, I think he came into office weak on national security and intelligence and was very captured by the CIA and also dazzled by the secrecy. And it's very easy, I think, to get wrapped up in the power of that. That doesn't excuse it at all. But again, he's been worse than Nixon, and that's not my conclusion. That's the conclusion of the New York Times.
God forbid, the New York Times. Thomas, I want to bring you in here, but I know Jim had something else to add.
No, I was just going to agree with it. I think it's a very complicated story. I don't think there's any one factor that's led to this. I've always looked back at the Plame case, the Valerie Plame leak investigation that led to Patrick Fitzgerald, who was then an independent prosecutor, issuing subpoenas of a lot of reporters. And I think the fact that when he began prosecuting the Plame case, he was given extraordinary power as an independent prosecutor, and so he could issue subpoenas without getting the Attorney General's authorization, which is normal for media subpoenas. And I think he essentially broke through an unspoken agreement that had been existing between the press and the government for about 30 years, in which the government would kind of look the other way and tolerate leaks. And I think his very zealous investigation of the Plame case convinced a lot of people at the Justice Department, we can do this, we can go ahead and subpoena reporters, and the political damage won't be that bad. We can prosecute leakers, and the political damage won't be bad. And I think a lot of other prosecutors at the Justice Department saw Fitzgerald become a star, and I think that was a model for the future within the Justice Department, that you can get ahead by prosecuting whistleblowers and subpoenaing reporters, and there won't be any political damage from it. And I think that was that kind of broke the glass on this, and then there were a lot of other factors after that, but I think that was kind of where this started.
Mm-hmm. So I want to bring Thomas in. You also have had your own encounters with this system at work. Tell us a little bit about that, and whether you agree then with this notion that actually the Obama administration is even tougher on whistleblowers than the Bush administration.
Well, first, I would agree it's far tougher on whistleblowers because although the Bush administration actually criminally investigated me, it never led to an indictment. There was a draft indictment, but they never actually pulled the trigger. And in fact, I think it's important to note that even in Bush's memoir, he actually said, people had differences about policy in terms of surveillance, policy in terms of secret programs, policy in terms of torture, quote unquote. But why prosecute them over policy differences? Mm-hmm. Obviously, I would more than suggest that it goes far beyond policy differences. So they withheld sort of crossing the Rubicon. And I think what happened with Obama, frankly, and I realize that what I say about Obama, although I respect the office of presidency, I no longer respect the president who occupies that office, given what happened to me. And he was personally aware of my case. Mm-hmm. He was brought to his attention. He was even confronted by my case in the Oval Office when he was given a transparency award that wasn't even on the public schedule, the White House calendar.
What was that? Maybe you can walk people through a little bit about the details.
It was like, wait a minute, you said during your 2008 campaign, right, leading up to the election, that whistleblowers are courageous and patriotic. And who better to call out government wrongdoing than whistleblowers from inside the system? Yet he's now presided over the most draconian crackdown of any administration, in fact, all administrations combined. You'd have to go back to the Daniel Ellsberg era. But I think it's important to note, in terms of sort of his space and how much personal umbrage he took when there were those out there holding up mirrors, to realize that he became president, and there is sort of this special transition where the outgoing president vacates the Oval Office and the incoming president now begins to occupy it. And I've described this before publicly, but I'll just say it in summary here. He saw all those secret powers that Bush had licensed unto himself. He says, I'm not going to take those off that platter. I like what I see, and I might just need those going forward. What I don't think people expected is that he would then see a way clear, largely behind the scenes, but also with a lot of pressure in Congress, and also a lot of leaking of themselves to the press, the mainstream media, that he would codify much of the, and I put this in quotes, air quotes, the legal framework from the Bush administration, and that he would institutionalize it. And I think it's extraordinarily revealing that in one of the appearances he made, it was actually the one right before the last one where he said, quipping, hey, I'll sign an executive order to keep you on The Daily Show, Jon Stewart. The one before that, when Jon Stewart had actually announced he was leaving The Daily Show, there was this interesting conversation where the president spoke of this, and you could tell he was already looking forward to his legacy as president once he left the office of the president. He spoke about a legal framework. Last time I checked, the only legal framework the president is obligated to preserve, protect, and defend is the Constitution of the United States. So how ironic is it that by virtue of someone like myself, who took an oath to support and defend the Constitution, would now become criminalized under the Obama administration for calling out criminal behavior and conduct and wrongdoing on the part of the government, and that he did actually go look backwards, not forwards, to bring forward some of those prosecutions from the Bush, some of the investigations from the Bush administration, and go ahead and prosecute them. And not just prosecute, but use the Espionage Act to do so. And the Justice Department, knowing full well there would be no public interest defense, and equating the disclosures to the press, or alleged disclosures to the press, or the alleged retention of information that ended up in people not authorized, quote unquote, to receive it, which was the press. Sources to the press, I keep emphasizing that. A direct assault on the First Amendment, the cornerstone of our Bill of Rights. Using the Espionage Act? Last time I checked, no real spy goes to the press with what they know.
Yeah, I'm afraid to say that's probably true. Jesselyn, let me bring you back in this, because you were a government lawyer at the time you made a decision to raise these concerns, to become a whistleblower. First of all, give us a little bit of an insight into like how conscious were you of that act, and that what the consequences were that it would sort of trigger for you, and then related to that, this mindset that Thomas is describing, like. Do you think it's different now? You know, the lawyers and the culture inside the Justice Department that you knew, would that have supported this kind of basically almost the criminalization of what, Jim has pointed out was sort of a de facto kind of accepted situation really for the previous few decades?
Yeah, in my case, it literally took place over the weeks and the first couple months following 9/11. So I don't think a lot of these policy decisions had been hammered out. For me, I did not conceive myself as a whistleblower. I don't think many of the clients I work with ever conceived of themselves as a whistleblower. It's like, oh, what you did is classic whistleblowing. And they're like, I'm not a whistleblower. But they don't realize they meet the legal definition in that they had a reasonable belief that what they saw evidenced fraud, waste, abuse, illegality, or dangers to public health and safety. So I don't think most people wake up and be like, I'm going to be a whistleblower today. I don't think that. I think most people just think they're trying to correct something, make something right. I think Tom is an exception, Snowden is an exception there, but I don't think most people initially think of themselves that way. I certainly did not until my attorney was like, oh, what you're describing is whistleblowing.
But what did you think you were doing?
I thought I was just trying to correct a wrong. As an ethics attorney, after the court, after my component, the ethics office in the Justice Department, had destroyed my emails in the first high-profile terrorism case after 9/11, and withheld those emails from the court after I had resurrected them and given them to my boss. I resigned, and at that point, I figured that they would be turned over to the court. They were not, and I ended up giving them to the media, and I thought, okay, at least now both sides will know about this. I had gone to the judge, by the way, who told me I had no standing because I had resigned from the Justice Department before I went to the media.
And your concerns were about the treatment of the American Taliban.
Yes, he was our first prisoner in the Afghanistan war, a guy named John Walker Lind, who was later dubbed the American Taliban. Not only did they fail to Mirandize him properly, but the Attorney General claimed that if he had a lawyer, he would have been permitted that lawyer, which was a complete lie because he did have a lawyer, and that his rights were carefully, scrupulously guarded, which they weren't because he was tortured. He was kept in a shipping container for days with no food, with bullet holes in his leg, tied up with duct tape, bound, gagged, blindfolded, with epithets, completely naked. I mean, it's like reminiscent of, it's kind of what we saw at Abu Ghraib 4 years later, but this was the first instance of it. So yes, that, for me, that was enough to push me over the line of, you hear your agency lying and you kind of think, okay, it's his prerogative, Attorney General's prerogative to take the position he wants. But then you realize when someone's facing a bunch of death sentence counts, for me, I felt like I couldn't live with myself if I didn't speak up and someone was put to death because I kept my mouth shut. In terms of how that mindset has shifted or evolved or devolved, as the case may be, with Obama, again, I go back to what Jim said with the Valerie Plame case. What was interesting in that case to me is that it really points out the difference between leaking and whistleblowing. Here, Richard Armitage and Scooter Libby had leaked the name of an undercover CIA operative, Valerie Plame, to punish a whistleblower, basically her husband, who had written an op-ed in the New York Times, I believe, that there was no yellow cake uranium in Africa, which was one of the pretexts for going to war with Iraq. That was a leak. It had no public value whatsoever. It was done purely to punish a whistleblower. And that is very different than whistleblowing, where people see an abuse that's being carried out in secret and that the public has a right to know about. But unfortunately, the term leaking and whistleblowing are often collapsed and used interchangeably. And I do think prosecutors in this administration know the difference, but I think it's something lost on the general public.
Mm-hmm. So Thomas, tell us a little bit about your thinking as you made the decision to become a whistleblower, which was probably, as Jesselyn pointed out, you were more conscious in a way of what you were doing. Give us a little bit of an insight. Did you understand the consequences that could potentially rain down upon you?
Yeah, I did. Mm-hmm. I was confronted by a number of things going on at NSA after 9/11, and I did do a tremendous amount of research on what was available to me in terms of channels, because I recognized that any channel that I would utilize, particularly with the things that I was about to blow the whistle on, and where I was going to confront NSA first internally and probably end up going to congressional committees and the Department of Defense eventually, that I would be exposed. because we're talking about high crimes and misdemeanors as defined by the Constitution. We're talking about multi-billion-dollar fraud, waste, and abuse. We're talking about covering up intelligence that NSA had that could have stopped 9/11 by itself. And NSA clearly had reasons to keep this out of people's inboxes. Clearly, NSA had reason to protect itself even from others in the government. And so when I made, even at NSA, shortly after 9/11, to confront my supervisor, as well as going to the Office of General Counsel, Inspector General's office, and then later I became a material witness and whistleblower for 2 9/11 investigations. I recognized that even then, that if NSA wanted to, even though I was a senior executive, they could make life extraordinarily difficult, and even administratively could say, hey, you're disloyal, you're betraying the institution, we can let you go. And I knew later, as all of that whistleblowing that I did, as well as in partnership, including whistleblowing in partnership with others, over several years, that once I made the fateful decision to touch the third rail, and in this case, what's the definition of third rail? You go to the press. You're coming out of the cold, I had to say it that way, or coming in from the cold.
Depends on the time of year.
Yes, it does. And you choose to establish a connection, and it's a bit surreal for me sitting here on the stage knowing that one of the leading investigative journalists in this country is with us, James Risen. As soon as you make that contact in whatever form, you've already crossed a line in terms of national security, particularly in the hyperinflated and fear and paranoia generated post 9/11. So when I made a fateful decision to go to the press in February of 2006, I knew that I was touching the third rail, and that meant that not only could I get fired, but that the government, if they wanted to, could do what they did to Daniel Ellsberg. I knew that then. But for me, it was necessary. It was necessary at that point because all the whistleblowing through every channel that existed had come to naught. And in fact, what is not often understood in terms of my own whistleblowing is that every single channel that I exercised at NSA, within Congress, DOD, and other places in government, were ultimately exposed me. And then I was retaliated during the course of that whistleblowing. Not often understood. And the evidence that was given to even congressional investigators was all censored and suppressed.
So in other words, you tried to go through regular channels to become an internal as opposed to a go-to-the-press whistleblower, and what you found was that, in fact, it wasn't producing results because it was either suppressed and it was also resulting in real-time, in effect, retaliation against you.
Real-time. In fact, I ended up, basically they said, you have no job anymore. They reorganized the Directorate of Engineering where I last worked at NSA. And when they finished reorganizing, I had an office and a flag and a computer and nothing else. So I found a job at the National Defense University. So it was out of sight, out of mind. But that was sort of the punch of your lateral arabesque to another position, another function, because you're a threat. You're an insider threat. I had become a dissident as far as NSA was concerned. And if you become a dissident within that kind of an institution, the white blood cells kick in culturally and to get rid of you. I would use other terms for the white blood cells, but
we get your meaning.
Get my meaning, get my drift.
So
But it's even saying it right now is, I mean, this is America, right? And yet somehow we have just said that long arc of history of which we're a part of, well, it doesn't matter anymore because 9/11 happened and now national security reigns supreme. I've called it the deep state religion. And so if you disagree, if you question authority, then you might find yourself facing prosecution. So when you're charged with espionage, I mean, it's an extraordinary charge. I mean, Obama just keeps using it. And what you don't hear about I'm one of the public figures,
Right.
pre-Snowden. A lot was disclosed in the 2006 timeframe. What you don't hear about are the dozens and dozens of people, actually going into the hundreds plus, even into the thousands in terms of people caught up in these investigations. And their patriotism, their loyalty, their character, all questioned.
Well, this is a really important point too, though, but I want to bring in Jim to talk about the consequences of this, but first I'm going to ask you kind of a provocative question. You said after 9/11, this is the result of that. Now, can you imagine a scenario where this would have occurred anyways, perhaps not in the same scale, perhaps not in the same tenor? I'm struck by the fact that it's Obama, not Bush, at a farther remove from 9/11 who's been pursuing these prosecutions, number one. Number two, look at the technology, in some ways that's powering this, that those developments would have occurred no matter what the temptation of some president to use drone warfare or other secret programs seems like it would have been pretty persuasive. People have argued for decades about sort of creeping secrecy and the overclassification of things. I don't know what the answer is, and it's kind of a hypothetical, but I'm just curious. I know that we talk about the convergence between 9/11 and the escalation of this, but pulling back, I'm just curious what your thoughts are on how directly causally related it is.
I think there is a relationship, but I would never want, and the government certainly has used the excuse even more recently in certain court cases, and I'll defer to Jess to talk about the Judge Leon decision that just came down the last couple of days, an extraordinary case all by itself. It comes down to who we are as Americans. It comes down to rule of law. It comes down to whether or not you can have license under yourself under the rubric of security. Well, hey, we're going to take some licenses that take away liberties and freedoms. I'm the first to acknowledge there's threats, but there's extraordinary temptation. And this is something that Frank Church actually warned the nation about in 1975 during a conclusion of an extraordinary set of hearings where it turns out that instruments of national power were being used to violate the rights of Americans on a rather large scale, even for its day and time, the technology of that day and time. Extraordinarily tempting under all kinds of other authorities, national security authorizations, to use that technology for other purposes, going far beyond its stated purpose. And that's what I was confronted by. I can say this in very stark terms. You talk about this convergence. That convergence took place right after 9/11. What I'm seeing is the subversion of the Constitution. I'm seeing the wheels coming off a form of government to which I take an oath to support and defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic. What I was seeing was an alien form of government arising from within. And it was saying, hey, 9/11 was actually indicative of a government who had failed to keep people out of harm's way. They're using it as a frame to then justify licensing under themselves all these extraordinary powers. Those are emergency powers. Those powers aren't granted in the Constitution. And no one has declared war, but we're acting like we're at war. And so we went into essentially a war footing, a war economy. And this is in part, and the whole world is a battlefield, including the United States of America. So I'm staring, this is in the first few days and weeks after 9/11, and then I'm confronting the lead attorney in the Office of General Counsel who said, Tom, you don't understand. The White House has approved the program, which is the mass surveillance program called Stellar Wind. It's all legal. And as soon as he said it's all legal, I remember as a very young teenager going all the way back to the Nixon era. Well, hey, if the president says it's okay, it's not illegal. Really? The president, in secret, is saying this is legal. What? For what? So that was the abyss. It's Pandora's box. I'm staring into it. It's staring back at me. What do? That's my moment of truth. Now, most people, it is true. You didn't make the decision, Tom. You weren't the one to authorize it. You weren't the implementer. Why would you get in the way? And this, after all, is national security. So you're seeing what had been, people don't realize this, those scandals, all the vast abuse of instruments of national power in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, culminating in the 70s, that led to a series of reforms. It led to 2 standing committees on intelligence, Senate and House respectively. It led to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978, which was updated 5 times prior to 9/11 to keep up with the technology and the times. So a 23 legal regime, which had hot pursuit options built in where you could actually go after a target, a real threat. It was a true threat to public safety, right? You could go after it, then go back to the court for the warrant, just tossed overboard after 9/11. So you tell me, rhetorical question here, you tell me then, what are you facing? If rule of law doesn't matter, if Constitution doesn't matter, if the principles and practices under which the country is founded and had evolved, if the arc of history bending toward justice doesn't matter, then what matters? And fundamentally, what's the center pin, cornerstone in all of this? It's the First Amendment. So this is what's extraordinarily, I think, troubling, and what is a direct threat to our special form of democracy, a constitutional republic, when you have a president who is more than willing to use instruments of national power to erode the very foundation of the country. For what? National security.
Jim, Thomas just called you the third rail of, I'm not sure, basically of the legal situation that a government employee would face by contacting you. How has it changed in the Obama administration, your ability to engage with sources inside the government, the chilling effect of cases like yours? Give us some texture and feel for what the very real consequences are of this.
Well, you know, the main reason I wanted to be on this panel was to say that the real problem is that whistleblowers face much greater dangers than reporters
That's
do.
right.
And that we in the press, you know, while the government can make our life difficult and can make our job hard, and they can threaten us and try to put you in jail, but it's far worse for sources and for whistleblowers like Tom. And so that's the first thing that I think we in the press have to recognize, is that we are doing a poor job in the press of trying to find ways to help sources and whistleblowers. We're basically doing nothing. And that is I don't know the solution to that. I don't know how to change that. But one of the problems I have seen is that there is, you know, cases like mine involving reporters generates a lot of sympathy in the press because it's one of our own. But then whistleblowers and sources don't get the same treatment from the press. They don't get the same treatment from the government or the public. And so the main thing I wanted to say today was that we have to find a way in the journalism to change that. And I don't know the answer, but I think we should start thinking about how do we help sources, how do we protect sources better, how do we find ways to change the dynamic that now exists where, you know, reporters like me get some protection, either legal or publicity-wise. I mean, my life has been made more difficult by the Obama administration, but I can still do my job, and people still want to talk to me. In fact, in a way, it's kind of been good advertising.
Right? Your name ID is up.
Yeah. So, and people know that, I refuse to testify. They know that I can be trusted. So there's it's a mix. Some people don't want to talk to you because it's dangerous, and others do. So, but I do think that the other thought I had about the way we treat whistleblowers today in the press, and it's a criticism I've had for quite a while because this is a criticism I've lived, and that is that we in the press, when there's a story about a whistleblower and there's a leak investigation, we treat it like a cop story, and we treat it like a criminal investigation, like there's who is the leaker, who is the source, and so it becomes a police procedural story very quickly, instead of a story about, is this the right thing for the government to be doing? And that gets to the larger issue, I think, of whistleblowers, is that it's very difficult for the government to accept that a whistleblower can be someone who disagrees with a policy. Mm-hmm. The government's definition of a whistleblower is just someone who sees waste, fraud, and abuse. And so they have this very micro view of what's acceptable whistleblowing. And someone like Edward Snowden, who sees this giant program that nobody knows about, is not considered a whistleblower because that was a policy authorized by the president. So I just think those are some big questions that we in journalism have to think about.
You know, Jess, I want to bring you in on sort of how we're looking forward, but first, tell us a little bit about from the other side, you know, journalists, how they're dealing with sources, what you've observed. My own anecdotal sense is that since the Snowden case in particular, that journalists have become much more aware of the needs to have a secure way of communicating with people, but that before that, basically, there was almost not indifference isn't the right word, but you know, it just didn't factor in the same way. Have you seen a shift in how journalists are willing to engage with you or some of your clients?
Not a huge shift. There was an earlier event not long ago that was for journalists, and when they did a poll of how many were using encryption, it was a handful.
Really?
Now, encryption is not, you can't just say encryption is source protection. I think that is a myth, basically, and a dangerous one. Source protection needs to be more than, oh, well, we encrypt and therefore we're safe. I mean, journalists don't want to get lawyers involved because they're under a misimpression that we're going to say, no, you can't put anything on the record, and no, you can't say this and that. But I would actually argue that we know how to keep people safe, and at least in my practice, I'm glad to bring people to the media because I think by and large, the media is more of a help than a hindrance to the whistleblower. But I said the only people who are using encryption less than journalists maybe are lawyers, and that's why in my new whistleblower and source protection program, tech and encryption and teaching that is part of it. But I also know that Jim Risen does this old school, and he's one of the greatest reporters in the country, and there's something to not relying so much on intelligence. I mean, the government, that's what we're faulting the government for. They have over-relied on electronic and tech instead of good old detective work, gumshoe, human intelligence. And that's how all the surveillance, despite all the surveillance, we failed to detect or prevent the Boston bombing, Denmark, Charlie Hebdo, all of that. I mean, it hasn't worked because you do need the human intelligence aspect of this. In terms of, this goes also to the, is a war on whistleblowers caused by the greater technology we have, which is the argument of Charlie Savage, one of your colleagues. And I think that's a cop-out. I think, yes, more technology makes it easier both to blow the whistle and easier to be caught. But to say, well, it's all because of technology completely absolves the government of responsibility for the prosecutorial discretion it has to ruin people's lives. And it's like saying, well, Obama's in a self-driving car, and therefore, the car just drives wherever it wants to, and, the government has nothing to do with this. The government has everything to do with this. And I think, encryption has changed somewhat. I mean, Tom communicated with a reporter in an earlier generation of encryption. Again, I don't think, I know a number of news agencies have secure drop, but again, a number is maybe, a dozen? I'm not sure. But I defer to you on talking about, I don't think encryption is like the panacea.
Right, it's not like there's a magic bullet, basically.
Right.
Yeah. Now, just quickly, bring us up to speed on this new ruling just in recent days and what you think the implications are, and then we're going to turn to the audience for some questions.
Sure. In the past day and a half, Judge Leon, who had found that the phone call records program is likely unconstitutional, that got appealed by the government on standing issues. He had to find people who fit the case better, which he did, meaning people who were customers of the right telecom. And basically, he ruled again, what he said is like, I made this ruling 13 months ago. This is still likely unconstitutional. And its effect, well, his injunction against collecting phone call data should go in immediately, but the government's appealing. But this would have happened anyway in a few weeks under the USA Freedom Act, which was also going to curb that program. I think the legal significance is that a court decided this, the constitutionality of it, and that is far different than Congress just saying something is legal, because Congress says plenty of things are legal that are later deemed unconstitutional. So that's significant, and I think it has huge significance for other math collection type programs being done by the NSA.
Mm-hmm. Tom, mass collection programs being done by the NSA, this is your field of expertise. Did you come away from the experience feeling that inherently is the problem, that there's just too broad of a brush that's possible now technologically? Are you, of the view that there are targeted ways? You suggested there's a legal framework before 9/11, but do you believe that the technology has basically gotten out of control in terms of what it can do?
I don't consider technology out of control. I simply think the government's gotten very lazy to using in secret the technology to do essentially mass surveillance on a scale that history has never experienced. It's again what Frank Church warned the nation about in 1975. The temptations are enormous. There is no question that and I've called it that NSA has a hoarding complex. They truly do. If you watch any of the hoarding shows, I think institutionally they decided and this is interesting enough in response to the failure of 9/11 in part.
Yeah.
I mean, we keep going back, like what are these trigger events? Well, one of them was clearly 9/11, and then they made this argument, we need to create a bigger haystack. But now they're not just putting more hay on top of hay in the barn, they're actually have a whole industry of creating more barns, digital barns, and stuffing them full of hay. And then that's not enough. We actually have to sort of like what they did in Vietnam, we have to basically wipe out forests, plant fields, and then we have to raise the grass because that's even more hay. So then everything becomes hay. So once everything's hay, that means every straw is a needle. So then what have you actually done? You made the problem far worse. Because then how do you find any of the needles in any of the haystacks? Well, that's part of the challenge. But here's the burden that I carry as well as others. All of this was solved in the 90s. It literally was solved. And I have to say it again because I have in part a stage to say it again. NSA recognized in the 90s, as I did and in partnership with others and other projects at NSA, recognized the huge challenge posed by the digital age. How do you make sense of far more information than we've ever had before? Mm-hmm. It wasn't just the information age, it was now exploding. That was a challenge problem that was taken on with the very best of American ingenuity and innovation, and it was solved. So why would you reject the very solution that not only solved the challenge of making sense and meaning, finding the needles in this vast sea of data, while still protecting the rights of human beings? Mm-hmm. That you would only use it to actually target real threats, or threats that you had gone above the threshold, of just merely suspicious. That was turned on its head. It was turned on its head because a decision was made within the deepest parts of the intelligence establishment that we just need everything. We need to have access to everything. So for me, I shudder because what do I recall from my own history? Listening in on East Germany during the Cold War, where the Stasi, their motto was to know everything.
Thomas, that's a great, I think, pivot point to bring in people. And I have to say, having lived in Russia even more than 15 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, we were instantly told, it's still wired, don't say anything indoors that you don't want broadcast now. And of course, it was also for sale by that point, when we lived in Russia. So it might not have been just the government
It's
itself
also a growth industry.
Absolutely.
Surveillance is a growth industry. A lot of people making a lot of money. One of the elephants in the room.